My husband auctioned our prenup in front of 200 people on a Saturday night in March, and the worst part was not what he said. The worst part was the laugh that followed. Not loud, not cruel in an obvious way, just the quiet, a collective laugh of 200 people, deciding in real time which side of something they were on and choosing the side that cost them nothing. I held my tears back. I had been holding things back for 2 years. My name is Claire Whitmore. I married Daniel 4 years ago when I was 30, when my brand consulting business had 7 years of client work behind it and a roster I had spent those same 7 years building from nothing. I was not wealthy when I met Daniel. I was self-made in the specific way that people are self-made when nobody handed them anything, and they learned early that the only reliable thing was the work itself. Daniel was 38. His logistics company was growing fast, and he was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately became the center of it. Not through aggression, but through the particular gravity of someone who has never had to try too hard at anything. I loved him. I want to say that clearly because it matters. This was not a calculated decision. I loved him the way you love someone when you are 30 and you have been working hard for 7 years and you finally meet a person who makes you feel like the working hard was building towards something rather than simply accumulating. When he asked me to sign a prenup, I signed it without reading it as carefully as I should have, because he was laughing when he handed me the pen and he said it was just a formality, and I trusted him because I was the kind of woman who trusted the man she married. That kind of woman, I was learning, was the easiest kind to betray. I gave up my client roster when we married because Daniel's schedule required flexibility I could not offer while managing my own clients. He said we were building something together. I moved into his house, managed his household, and became the person who made his professional life run smoothly enough that he could focus on the parts of it that got him credit. I continued consulting, quietly, for 3 of my original clients who preferred working with me directly but agreed to route their contracts through Daniel's company for the sake of administrative simplicity. I did the work. The revenue went into Daniel's books. I did not think about this arrangement critically for 2 years, because I was building a marriage and marriages require a certain amount of trust that overrides the instinct to track everything. The gold digger narrative started 18 months in, at the specific moment when Daniel's company crossed a threshold that made the people around him begin to reassess the people around him. His college roommate Marcus said something at a poker game. Daniel reported it to me with the apologetic tone of a man delivering a message he wants to seem reluctant about. "Marcus thinks you married me for the lifestyle." He said it lightly. I dismissed it. I did not understand that it was the first brick. The bricks accumulated quietly. Daniel's sister made a comment about how quickly I had given up my career. His business partner made a joke about trophy wives at a dinner I had helped plan. Daniel repeated these things to me with his apologetic tone, each time slightly less apologetic, each time the story slightly more established, as if repetition was a form of evidence. He was not the one saying it, he was just reporting what others said. He was generous enough to keep me informed. I defended myself for 18 months to an audience that had already decided. I sat at our kitchen table and walked Daniel through the consulting work, the revenue, the client relationships that predated our marriage entirely. He listened with the patient expression of a man humoring someone. "I know that's how you see it," he said once. "I know you believe that." And then he left the room, and I sat with the understanding that the conversation I had been trying to have was not a conversation he was interested in. He had a version of events. The version served him. He was not going to examine it. I started keeping records the following week. It was not strategic at first. It was the instinct of someone who has been told her version of events is wrong and has decided to document it so thoroughly that it becomes impossible to dismiss. 7 years of client files. Bank statements organized chronologically. Copies of the 3 contracts routed through Daniel's company, with the deliverables and billing rates and the relationship history that predated the marriage entirely. I kept all of it in a folder in a cloud account Daniel did not have access to, and I added to it whenever something new was relevant. The 6 months before the gala were the quietest of our marriage. Daniel had stopped fighting. He had replaced the low-level friction with a specific pleasantness I could not name, but that felt, underneath, like anticipation rather than peace. He was pleasant the way a man is pleasant when he has already made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to execute it. I read it at first as progress. That was my mistake. I mentioned it to my friend Diane at lunch 2 weeks before the gala. Diane had known me since before Daniel, since the years when I was building my roster and living in an apartment I paid for and thinking about futures that belonged entirely to me. She listened to everything and then said, "Claire, talk to a lawyer. Something is coming and I think you already know it." I called Sandra Cho that afternoon. Sandra reviewed what I had in 2 meetings. Then she told me something that reorganized several things I had been thinking about. The consulting work I had done for Daniel's 3 clients, routed through his company, had generated revenue that, under the specific language of our prenup, was attributed to Daniel's business rather than my individual contribution. The prenup I had signed laughing, because Daniel had said it was a formality, had been written in language that was considerably less casual than the signing had been. Sandra explained what it would mean if the marriage ended with things as they stood. Then she explained what it would mean if I could demonstrate that the revenue was attributable to my work specifically, and that I had a prior relationship with those clients that predated the marriage entirely. "Can you demonstrate that?" she said. "Yes," I said. "I have everything." "Then we're in a different conversation," Sandra said. That was 10 days before the gala. I spent those 10 days getting everything into the format Sandra needed, working in the evenings after Daniel had gone to his calls or wherever he went in the evenings now, which I had stopped asking about. I was organized and thorough and completely calm, which was the state I entered when something important needed to be done and there was no room for anything other than doing it. The night of the gala, I put on the dress Daniel had chosen, helped the event staff with a last-minute seating issue, arrived on Daniel's arm, and spent 2 hours being exactly who he needed me to be. I was warm with the clients I knew. I was gracious with the ones I was meeting for the first time. I ate the dinner I had selected from the menu options 6 weeks earlier. I smiled at the right moments and laughed at the right moments and did everything that 6 years of being Daniel Whitmore's wife had taught me to do in a room full of people who mattered to his business. At 10:15, he stood up with a microphone and an envelope I recognized from our safe and said, "I want to do something a little different tonight. A little audience participation." The room laughed. "I have a prenuptial agreement here and I'm putting it up for auction. Who wants to free me from this gold digger?" The laugh that followed was the worst sound I have ever heard. I held everything still. I had been holding things still for 2 years and I was very good at it. $4 million. The voice came from the back of the room. It did not need to be loud. It had the quality of a voice that has never needed volume to be heard. The kind of certainty that carries across a room by weight rather than by decibel. The laughter stopped, like someone had switched it off. Daniel turned around. James Calloway was standing near the back. The kind of man whose name appeared in acquisition articles and market coverage, whose company operated in adjacent space to Daniel's in the way that serious competitors operate, politely in public and considerably less politely where actual decisions got made. He was looking at me. Not at Daniel. At me. I stood up. I don't know exactly when I decided. I think the decision made itself, the way certain decisions do when you have been sitting still long enough and the right moment finally arrives, and your body moves before your mind has finished the sentence. I picked up my bag. I walked around the table and across the room toward James Calloway, who watched me come without moving, and when I reached him, I said quietly enough that only he could hear, "What do you actually want?" He looked at me for a moment. Up close, he was less impressive than from across a room, which is true of most people and which I noted. "Your husband's company has a vulnerability," he said. "You know what it is. I want to know what you know." I stood in the Hargrove Hotel with 200 people watching, and I thought about 7 years of client work and 3 contracts, and Sandra's voice saying we're in a different conversation, and the folder in the cloud account Daniel did not have access to. I thought about what James was actually buying, and what Daniel had actually been selling, and what I was actually in this room, which was neither the thing Daniel had described nor the opportunity James had calculated, but something neither of them had been able to see because they had both been looking at me as a function of their own plans rather than as a person with plans of her own. "I'll take the $4 million, I said. "And I'll tell you what I know. But not because you asked, Because it's accurate, and accurate information should be with people who use it correctly. And because my husband just auctioned our prenup in front of 200 people, and I am done being managed by men who think my value is something they get to set. James looked at me for a long moment. "Deal," he said. I turned around. Daniel was still at the front of the room with the microphone and the envelope and the smile that wasn't quite a smile anymore. I walked back and held out my hand, and he gave me the envelope because he was in a room with 200 people watching and he had run out of moves, and some part of him knew it. I signed what needed to be signed at the table one of James's people produced, and I walked out of the Hargrove Hotel at 10:23 in the dress my husband had chosen. I sat in my car in the Hargrove Hotel parking garage for 11 minutes before I started the engine. Not because I was crying, because I was thinking, and I needed the thinking to be finished before I moved. James Calloway had not walked into that gala and made a $4 million bid on impulse. That was the first thing I knew with certainty. Men like James Calloway did not make $4 million decisions on impulse. They made them after research, after calculation, after the kind of quiet preparation that looked from the outside like spontaneity, but was actually the product of considerable work done in advance. He had been in that room for a reason. The bid had been ready before Daniel opened his mouth, which meant James had known something was going to happen tonight, which meant he had either known Daniel specifically, or he had known the kind of man Daniel was and had made a reasonable prediction, or someone had told him. Any of those three options led to the same place, which was that James Calloway had walked into that room with a plan that involved me, and the plan had nothing to do with my welfare and everything to do with whatever he believed I was carrying. I thought about what I was carrying. 3 client relationships predating my marriage routed through Daniel's company. 7 years of documentation. The specific nature of the work I had done for those clients, which was brand consulting at a level of detail and access that most consultants never achieve, because most consultants do not become the de facto chief relationship officer for companies that trust them completely. I knew things about those 3 companies that their own boards did not know, because I had been brought in at the level of trust that precedes formal governance, and I had never violated that trust, which was why they kept renewing, and why they had agreed to the routing arrangement in the first place. One of those 3 companies was also a client of James Calloway's firm. I had known this abstractly for some time. I understood it differently now. Sitting in a parking garage at 10:30 p.m. in a dress my husband had chosen, I called Sandra. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting. I had called her the day after the gala planning meeting 3 weeks ago, and told her something was coming and she had said she would be available. She was a woman who meant what she said. I told her everything. The auction, James's bid, what he had said to me, what I had said back, the deal I had made standing in the Hargrove Hotel with 200 people watching, which I was now understanding more completely than I had when I made it. Sandra was quiet for a moment when I finished. Not the quiet of someone processing, she had been processing while I was talking. The quiet of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is deciding how to present it. "Claire," she said, "what James wants from you is not just competitive intelligence about Daniel's company. What James wants is the relationship with the client you share. He wants you to bring him into that relationship or to give him information that lets him access it without you." "I know," I said. "And you agreed to tell him what you know." "I agreed to tell him accurate information," I said. "I didn't agree to tell him only him." Another pause. Shorter. "Who else are you thinking?" "There's a regulatory question in what I know," I said, "about how those contracts were structured, about the revenue attribution, about some of the billing practices on Daniel's end that I noticed about 8 months ago and documented and didn't know what to do with until you told me we were in a different conversation." "I told you that 10 days ago," Sandra said. "I've been thinking about it for 10 days, I said. She was quiet again. "If you bring this to a regulatory body, the timeline becomes theirs. You lose control of how it unfolds." "I know," I said. "And James will be angry," I said. "He'll feel like he paid $4 million for something he didn't get. But James made a $4 million bid on a woman he didn't know in a hotel ballroom based on a calculation that she would be desperate enough and grateful enough to give him exactly what he asked for. He made an assumption about who I was. I started the engine. He was wrong about that too. I drove home, not to Daniel's house, to Diane's, where I had been leaving things in the spare room for 6 weeks, quietly, in the way I did everything that mattered, without announcing the plan until the plan was ready. Diane was awake. She had been awake, the way she had been available and not asking questions for 6 weeks. The specific support of a friend who understands that the most useful thing she can do is be present without filling the presence with noise. She made tea I didn't drink and sat across from me while I finished thinking out loud, and at 1 a.m. she said, "What do you need tomorrow?" "Nothing tomorrow," I said. "Tomorrow I have a meeting with James Calloway." James called at 8 the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. His message was professional, smooth, entirely without reference to the previous evening, the kind of message that treats a dramatic public moment as a routine business development opportunity, which told me something about how James Calloway moved through the world. I texted back a time and an address, a coffee place I knew, neutral ground, and spent the 2 hours before the meeting reviewing my documentation one more time. He was already there when I arrived, which I had expected. He had chosen a table with his back to the wall, which I had also expected. He stood when I came in, which I had not expected, and I noted it as information without deciding what it meant. "Thank you for last night," I said, sitting down. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "It was a business decision." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm not thanking you for the reason it looked like." Something shifted in his expression, the specific micro-adjustment of a person who expected to be the smartest one in the room and is revising that expectation in real time. "Fair," he said. "So let's talk about what I actually get for $4 million. Let's talk about what you think you're getting first," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he laid it out, cleanly and without pretense, which I respected even as I registered how wrong he was about several of his assumptions. He wanted access to the Meridian account, one of my 3 original clients, now the largest of the 3, a company whose relationship with Daniel's firm had been built entirely on my work, and whose key decision-maker, a woman named Patricia Chen, had made clear over 4 years that she was loyal to me rather than to any particular corporate vehicle I was associated with. James's firm had been trying to get into Meridian for 2 years. He believed that I was the door. "You're not wrong about Patricia," I said. "She trusts me." Then, "But what I'm going to give you," I said, "is not access to Patricia. What I'm going to give you is accurate information about Daniel's company and the way the Meridian contract was structured, which I believe you'll find is information that belongs in more than one conversation." He studied me. "What does that mean?" "It means I have documentation of billing practices on Daniel's side of the Meridian relationship that are not consistent with the contract terms," I said. "It means some of what Daniel has been charging Meridian for is work that was actually performed by me under an arrangement that was never disclosed to them. It means Patricia Chen has been paying Daniel's company for a service that was being delivered by someone Daniel has spent 2 years publicly describing as a gold digger who contributed nothing." I watched James understand what I was telling him. Not the competitive intelligence angle he had come for, something larger and messier and considerably more useful to someone who knew how to use it. "If Patricia knew this," he said slowly, "Patricia would have questions," I said, "about Daniel, about the contract, about what she's actually been paying for and who. And you're going to tell her." "I'm going to give Sandra everything, and Sandra is going to do what Sandra thinks is appropriate," I said, "which includes Patricia, which also includes the relevant regulatory body that oversees billing practices in Daniel's industry, which also, because I am giving you the information I agreed to give you, includes you, with the understanding that what you do with accurate information is your decision and whatever you do with it is yours to account for." James was quiet for a long moment. The coffee shop moved around us, ordinary, indifferent. "You're not giving me the exclusive," he said. "No," I said. "I'm giving you accurate information. You bid $4 million on the assumption that you were buying a door. You were buying information. The information is real. What you do with it is your business. But I'm not your instrument, and I was never going to be." He looked at me across the table with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had been confident in. You decided this last night, he said. In the parking garage. Yes, I said, before you called your lawyer. While I was calling my lawyer, I said. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. The 4 million stands, he said finally. Because the information is real and because I made an assumption about who you were and I was wrong and that's on me. I stood up. I appreciate that, I said. And James, whatever you do with what I've given you, make sure it's something you'd be comfortable having examined. Because everything I'm giving Sandra is going to be examined, and the picture it paints of how this whole arrangement worked is fairly complete. I left him with that, and I did not look back. Sandra filed with the regulatory body on a Wednesday. She also sent a formal communication to Patricia Chin, on my behalf, outlining my role in the Meridian relationship and the nature of the billing arrangement that had been in place. Patricia responded within 4 hours, which told me she had suspected something for longer than she had said. The regulatory inquiry opened the following week. It was not fast, and it was not clean, and it involved considerably more lawyers than I had anticipated, which Sandra had warned me about and which I had accepted as the cost of doing something correctly rather than quickly. James's firm was named in the inquiry as an adjacent party, which he had not anticipated when he made his bid and which complicated his own plans in ways he apparently found frustrating, based on the 2 emails he sent me that I did not answer. Daniel called me the morning after the regulatory inquiry opened. I was at Diane's kitchen table with coffee and my laptop and the specific calm of someone who has been waiting for a phone to ring and is not surprised when it does. He called 3 times before I picked up. The 3rd call I answered because 3 calls in 10 minutes from Daniel Whitmore meant he had run out of the patience that money usually gave him in abundance, and running out of patience was a version of Daniel I had not seen often and wanted to hear clearly. "What did you do?" he said. No greeting. No pretense. "I gave accurate information to the appropriate people," I said. "You went to the regulators." His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before, something underneath the anger that was closer to fear, the specific fear of a man who has been operating on the assumption that his position is unassailable and has just discovered an assailant. "Among others," I said. "Claire?" He said my name the way he said it when he was trying to re-establish something, trying to pull the conversation back to a register where he was in control. "Whatever you think you're doing, you need to understand what this looks like. Going to regulators, making deals with my competitor in the middle of a company gala, responding to being auctioned in front of 200 people," I said. He was quiet for a moment. The silence of a man who has been caught using an argument that does not hold up to the thing it is being held up against. "That was a mistake, I understand that, but what you've done in response is going to damage both of us." "It's going to damage you," I said. "I've already spoken to Sandra about what it means for me, and the picture is considerably less damaging than the one you were setting up with the prenup auction and 2 years of calling me a gold digger to everyone in your professional circle." Another silence. Longer. I could hear him breathing, which was something I had not noticed in years because Daniel's breathing had been background noise in my life for so long that it had stopped registering as a sound. I heard it now, and it was unsteady in a way that told me Sandra's filing had hit something real. "The Meridian billing," he said finally. "Yes," I said. "You know what that's going to look like." "I know exactly what it's going to look like," I said. "It's going to look like your company has been billing a client for work that was performed by your wife, who you have spent 2 years publicly describing as someone who contributed nothing to your life or your business. It's going to look like the revenue attribution in our prenup does not reflect the actual source of that revenue. It's going to look like a regulatory problem that Sandra is very good at helping people navigate, which is why I hired her before the gala and not after." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call had not dropped. It hadn't. Daniel was still there, on the other end, doing the math that I had been doing for 6 months and that he was doing for the first time, the math that produced the same answer no matter how many times you ran it. "What do you want?" he said finally. Not belligerently, not strategically. The genuine question of a man who has exhausted his other options and is now at the place where the actual conversation can begin. I had thought about this question for 6 months. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a person who has been wronged and is anticipating the moment of correction. With the specific clarity of someone who knows exactly what she is owed and has the documentation to support the number. I told him. He did not argue. That surprised me more than anything else that happened in the weeks that followed. More than the regulatory findings. More than Patricia Chen's formal statement to Sandra's office. More than the settlement conference where Daniel's lawyer looked at what Sandra had assembled and asked for a 3-hour recess that turned into 2 days. Daniel himself did not argue. He had Sandra's filing, and he had Patricia's statement, and he had whatever James Calloway's attorney had communicated to his own counsel about the nature of the bid at the gala and what it had purchased. And the combination of those things had produced in Daniel Whitmore the first genuine stillness I had ever seen from him. He was still in the way that people are still when the version of events they have been living inside has collapsed around them and they are standing in the wreckage trying to understand what is actually there. I did not feel sorry for him. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier and more flattering to say that I did. That I looked at Daniel in the settlement conference and felt the complicated grief of a marriage ending and a person diminished. I felt none of that. What I felt was the completion of something. The specific feeling of an account that has been outstanding for a long time, being finally, accurately, settled. The settlement reflected what I was actually owed. Not what Daniel had been prepared to give me when he had planned the gala auction, which had been nothing beyond the prenup terms he had laughed about while I signed them. Not what he had offered in the first conversation Sandra had with his lawyer, which had been considerably more than nothing and considerably less than accurate. What we arrived at, and after Sandra laid everything out in the conference room and Daniel's lawyer looked at it for 2 days, was a number that matched the documentation, which is the only number that actually means anything. Patricia Chen called me the week after the settlement was signed. Not through lawyers, not through intermediaries. She called my personal number, which she had always had, and she said she had been thinking about what to say for several days and had decided the most useful thing she could offer was simple. "I want to work with you directly," she said. "Whatever structure makes sense, but directly." I told her I would have Sandra draw something up. She said she would have her own counsel look at it and we could move quickly. We moved quickly. The contract was signed within 3 weeks, and it was, in the specific terms of its revenue attribution and deliverable structure, very clear about who was doing the work and what they were being paid for it. The other 2 original clients followed within a month. Not because I asked them to, not because I applied any pressure. Because the nature of what had happened with Daniel's company had become known in the way that these things become known in professional circles where people pay attention, and the nature of what had happened clarified for those clients what had always been true, which was that their relationship had been with me and the corporate vehicle had been incidental. James Calloway sent a 3rd email in the month after the settlement. This one was different from the first 2. It did not ask for anything. It said in 4 sentences that he had underestimated what he was dealing with at the Hargrove Hotel, and that he respected the way things had unfolded, and that if I was ever interested in a conversation about a different kind of arrangement, one that treated me as a principal rather than as an asset to be acquired, he would welcome that conversation. I read it twice. I did not answer it. Not because I was angry and not because the door was permanently closed, but because I had just spent 4 years being managed by men who thought my value was something they got to set, and I was not in a hurry to walk into another room where someone else was holding the terms. I would decide what the terms were, in my own time, on my own. I moved into my own apartment in April, a place I had chosen for myself in a building where my name was on the lease, and the lease reflected my actual income, which was, as it turned out, considerably more substantial than anything Daniel had given me credit for producing. I set up my office in the 2nd bedroom, the one with the morning light, and on the first day I sat at my desk I looked at the client list on my screen and thought about where I had been 4 years ago when I gave it up, and where I was now and what the difference between those 2 points actually was. The difference was not $4 million, though that was part of it. The difference was not the settlement, though that was part of it too. The difference was something harder to name and more durable than any of the financial specifics. The difference between being inside a story that someone else was writing about you and standing outside it, reading it clearly, understanding exactly what it was and what it was not, and deciding what you were going to write instead. Daniel had written me as a gold digger. James had written me as an asset. Two different stories, two different men, both of them wrong about the same fundamental thing, which was that I was a character in their narrative rather than the author of my own. I opened my laptop. I started the first email to a client I had been meaning to reach out to for 3 months. I wrote it in the voice I had always had when I was working, direct and specific, and entirely without the management and performance that 4 years of being someone's wife in that particular way had required. It felt like putting on clothes that fit after a long time in clothes that didn't, the specific comfort of returning to the shape of yourself after you have been bent into someone else's required shape for longer than you realized. Diane came over that evening with food I hadn't asked for and a bottle of wine I was grateful for, and we sat at my kitchen table in my apartment, and she asked how the first day felt, and I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Like the beginning of something," I said. "Not a comeback, not a recovery, just the beginning. Like I was 30 again, but with considerably better information." She raised her glass. I raised mine. Outside the window, the April evening was doing its ordinary things, indifferent and complete, the city moving the way cities move when they are not paying particular attention to any one person's story, which is most of the time, which is actually a relief when your story has been subject to an audience for as long as mine had been. I was not a gold digger. I had never been a gold digger. I had been a woman who loved someone and trusted him and gave up things that mattered to her and was told, when that stopped being convenient, that the giving had been taking all along. I had been that woman for 4 years, and I was finished being her, and the finishing felt not like an ending but like a door I had been standing in front of for a long time finally opening into a room that was entirely, exactly mine. I finished my wine. I went to bed early. In the morning I had 3 client calls and a contract to review, and an email to write to a 4th client who had reached out the previous week through a mutual contact, someone who had heard, through the particular channels through which professional reputations travel, that Claire Whitmore was available, and that working with her directly was a different and better experience than whatever arrangement had existed before. They had heard correctly. I was available. I was ready. And the arrangement going forward was going to be entirely on my terms, documented clearly, attributed accurately, and managed by no one except me.